In the late 1960s, an Australian legend was created. It was a car, a homegrown Grand Tourer that was to change the way Australians looked at driving forever. Built for speed, it conquered mountains and captured the imagination of an entire generation. It started a legend that became known by two simple letters. This is the story of the Falcon GT. And the legend continues. By the 1960s, Australian society was undergoing rapid change. Women's lib, emergence of consumerism and the Vietnam War were transforming the sleepy land down under into a brave new world. Australia was on the verge of an economic boom, and people were eager to enjoy the pleasures denied to them by years of hard times. And like the rest of the world, we wanted cars. Fast cars.
Smooth and lively. New Falcon for 64, now priced with the lowest priced six-cylinder car. 64 Falcon with certified golden quality.
But we wanted more. We wanted cars like the ones in the American movies. And so a new type of car was created. Based on the standard Falcon, the powerful homegrown GT was to push the boundaries of motoring in Australia.
The high points of the history of the Falcon GT begin in 1967, of course, when there was just this car. It was a limited edition special, and Ford, as it were, put a toe in the water to see how this thing would go, and people rushed out to buy them, and it was a fantastic, magical car. And the racing thing went on after that. And of course, then you've just got the images on the black and white television of Allan Moffat and his Phase 3 at Bathurst and racing against Peter Brock, and it's all that sort of stuff. You cannot separate the history of the cars from the history of the racing.
GT stands for Grand Tourer, and the XR GT was just that. It was a powerful vehicle, unlike any other Australian-produced car, with big road presence. The GT was first put to the test at Bathurst in 1967, raced in the Ford Works team under the leadership of Harry Firth.
There's no substitute for Cubic engine.
Racing with Harry was Fred Gibson.
Bathurst in those days was more a sport then than it is a business now. And I remember Harry towing the car up there. It was a works car behind a panel van on a trailer. And that's the way the works car was presented, sort of thing.
I picked out Fred Gibson. He's the up-and-coming young bloke who drove sports cars not very well. I thought I can make something of Fred. He seems to have the right answers. I rang him up. I said, get down here and we'll meet you at Bathurst and we'll do something about this race.
56 feet, tread on the pedal, and some $100,000 surges forward in a blue haze of burnt rubber.
This was the GT's racing debut.
Cross pit straight and the Falcon's mean business. Is this showmanship or can they keep it going?
The Ford team pushed the pace all day.
5 years' history here suggests Mount Panorama is too tough for the big cars. Busted stub axles, overheating, brake failure or similar could be expected.
By the end of the day, it appeared that the hard work was paying off.
Nerves are wire-taut, the strain tremendous. Public largely unaware of the drama as Gagan gradually narrows Gibson's lead, second by second, lap by lap. And here's that vital pit stop. Gagan about 56 seconds behind. Less than an hour to go. Firth in control. Do nothing. No time to change drivers. Get that petrol in. 5 gallons. And go. Actual stop, 25 seconds. Still in front, but not by much. But these are the dying moments when drivers talk to their machines, coax them round. Here's the actual difference between Gibson and Gagan on the last lap. Gibson is the dark car up front. Holders, and you'll see Gagan in 53. Here he goes, 11 seconds behind.
But, much to the dismay of Firth and Gibson, the checkered flag fell on the racing Gagan brothers.
But up in the tower, the cross-checking ARDC execs now more than suspect they've made a boo-boo.
But they dropped the flag on the Gagans. What's going on here? You know, so we find that they had run out of petrol, going around the corner up on the mountain straight, gone in the pit gate, ran through the back of the pits, and come out, been credited with another lap because they're in the pit lane, and filled up the petrol. Now that is totally and utterly not allowed. They should have been excluded.
Weeks later, officials rectified their mistake, but this was no real compensation for not being winner on the day.
And the thing that really bugged me is they wouldn't give me back the class ribbon. It wasn't ribbon, it was the principle of it.
With its maiden win, the GT made its mark on the Australian motor racing scene. With such euphoria surrounding the victory, it was no wonder that more than one person took responsibility for its creation.
That's controversial because I think really back in those days, Harry said like it was his creation and Bill Burke said it was his. But being the sort of guys they both were, I think they were both very much involved in the creation of GT. And it was a creation of something like building a supercar.
Bill Burke was Assistant Managing Director of Ford Australia. Fresh from HQ in Detroit, he had a head full of ideas and petrol running through his veins.
Prior to the GT coming along, I described the Australian car scene as plain vanilla, pretty blah. Matter of fact, when I first went to Australia, things like heaters being standard equipment was unheard of. We had no air conditioning in Australia. Of all places that should have air conditioning, it should be Australia. Our initial V8 bills were specifically for the police, the various state police departments, and it became very popular with the police. Once we got greater availability of V8 engines, we introduced it to the public, and the V8 was extremely popular. Was Ford Australia eager to sell V8 Falcons to the police? Absolutely. The police were clamoring for them.
We had the two police pursuit cars, and they were part of the XR program. They were in the program. They were probably a minor variant. It really only added, a fourth engine and a fifth gearbox. And so we demonstrated that, and then we thought, gee, this is not a bad car. So after the XR program was done and finished and the cars were actually in production, we took that production car and made up a prototype GT out of that, and then lowered it, put wider wheels on it, put better rubber, and a few things like that, and made a GT. So that was the start.
It was really my idea. I, of course, am American, and I found out in my, by that time, 3 years in Australia, that young Australians are crazy about cars. And I thought that, you know, giving it a GT badge and some Go Faster stripes and a few other little things might make it appeal to the young people.
The head of the racing team was eager to get his hands on this new, powerful car.
I used to take it up the road to Maryborough of a night time, and I'd put my cap on, you know, and you'd sit by the side of the road, you'd pick some person up, whoosh, you know, behind him and sit there, and then you'd let him go. And a lot of people would have, you know, a lot of pitter-patter.
But the idea of a four-door sports car was not greeted with as much enthusiasm by the executives in head office in the US.
Did my US colleagues laugh at me because we had a four-door GT? Absolutely. Prior to our bringing out the Falcon GT, all GTs in the world were all two-door models. Certainly all those in the United States, and I believe all those in Europe.
And so a legend was born. Although the first GT was released to the public in only one colour, GT Gold, there were 6 specifically produced XR GTs painted silver with red racing stripes. These were the Gallagher 500 cars, made for the cigarette company Gallagher.
Itchy feet. Fascinating, isn't it?
Coming up, we go halfway around the world, 60 style.
10,500
And take a long look back at the way racing used to be.
Robert's car spins and crashes backwards down a steep slope.
replacement for the XR was the XT. Australian built, its makers claim much of its heritage from the classic US Mustang.
More thunder, more Mustang. You won't need any spurs.
If Ford were testing the waters with the XR GT, they committed themselves 100% to the full-blown production car with the XT. The new XT GT was available in a range of colours, including white, zircon green and candy apple red.
Surfers' Paradise, Australia's leading tropical resort city. Motor racing presents the only real opposition to the standard attractions of golden Pacific beaches, beautiful bikinied girls and a hectic but colourful nightlife.
The first big challenge for the XT GT was Queensland's Rothmans 12-hour race for saloon cars.
It's go, and the 42 drivers race to their cars in a traditional The Man stunt. Winning the moral-boosting foot race is Brisbane radio disc jockey Bill Gates. It'll prove to be some omen, because 12 long, tiring hours later, Gates and co-driver Jim Bertram will bring their Ford Falcon GT home in first place. The cars are near stock standard, only the most minor adjustments to engine, suspensions and exhaust systems have been allowed. Cars must have been manufactured or assembled in Australia. 200 examples of the particular make are required to have been registered for ordinary road use since January 1964.
This rule was common in Australian touring car racing at the time, and compared with today, simple and very effective.
Tyre wear is severe during the race, particularly in the first hours before the track is coated with oil and rubber. One pit-side statistician calculated that during practice and the actual race, more than 800 tyres are changed. Night, and rather than slackening, the pace intensifies. In the General Motors camp, the retirement of their top crews is causing long faces.
After 12 long hours, the flag fell on the Jim Bertram, Bill Gates team.
The flag goes down for the leading Falcon with Jim Bertram at the wheel, while Bill Gates, who drove most of the way, gets ready to join him in celebrating the win. Victory is sweet.
Racing in the 60s was a pretty innocent affair. There wasn't the pressure, the hype, or the safety measures.
When we raced in Bathurst in the 60s and the early 70s, there were no safety fences at all on the top of the mountain, or down the mountain for that matter. We used to, not knowingly, wear cotton racing gear, and our racing helmets were not very substantial, and our seat harnesses weren't like they are today. So we had a lot to learn in those days about safety.
Bathurst is so much safer circuit today than it was in them days. They had not a lot of safety arm car in them days. You actually just drive off the top of the mountain if you got a little bit crossed up coming onto Skyline there, and you could actually fall off the side of the road. So I'm probably glad that that I'm racing in the era I am now.
But almost immediately after going over Skyline, Robert's car spins and crashes backwards down a steep slope. Although the car is a write-off, fortunately, Roberts is only dazed.
The track, as you look back on the old days and look at the movies and the films of the race, it really was sort of back in the arcades, wasn't it? Like it was sort of wooden fences and no pits and things like that. And I think really we used to drive in sort of like those types shirt sleeves and sort of helmets with leather sides and things. So it was old times.
During the GT heydays, there were some spectacular crashes at Bathurst, including this horrifying flip at Skyline.
Bill Brown's car flipped and became airborne when only a few cars had gone through. In the worst traffic jam the race has known, 15 cars banked up.
Bill Brown had a brush with death again in 1971.
Bill tells how it happened.
As I come over the blind approach to McPhillamy Park Corner and a speed in excess of 100 miles an hour, a tyre burst on the car, causing it to veer straight ahead into the bank. And I was a bit worried, for the crowd's sake, that the car would sort of jump the fence and end up in amongst the people. There was just crashing and glass breaking and banging and carrying on. When the car finally came to rest, I was still conscious, and they just ran over and they started to tip the car up. And I yelled out to them to stop, smell petrol, and I asked, If anyone's smoking, would they kindly leave?
If the GT's debut in '67 was a huge success, then Bathurst '68 was a real ordeal. Racing with Barry Bow-Seaton that year in the Harry Firth Works GT was Fred Gibson.
Ford moves into first place. Close behind him, Des West.
Driving with Harry in '68 was really probably an education for both Bo and I, because Harry was the team manager and we were the drivers. And I suppose, like, against the Monaros, I think it was the 327 Monaros, that they had miles more grunt than we had. So we had a great dice with all the Monaros. We'd pass them across the top of the mountain on the twisty bits, and they'd grunt past us down the straight and back up the hill again.
And after 41 laps, the pace has stepped up. With an incredible burst of speed, Des West shatters the old lap record by nearly 5 seconds.
But the expectations of the big, heavy GTs was too much, and the pressure soon took its toll.
Car 9 is still ahead, but just when the Ford camp's becoming confident, real trouble strikes the Gagan machine. The Falcon's disc brakes burn out. Replacement takes 16 minutes.
Brake and tyre hassles often plagued the GTs, but they weren't the only problems.
Then more trouble, and this time it's the leader, Barry Seaton, pulling in with a suspected blown head gasket. Time is running out and every second vital. A radiator refill, some rapid cooling, and the car is sent back onto the track. Now, miles behind, Gagan attempts a miracle. And it appears Harry Firth believes in them too as he orders more speed.
So it's one of those sort of days where, you know, they'd pass us and we'd pass them, and it went on and on all day until probably about 2 hours to go, and we had the upper hand and we were leading the race, and then Bo was driving the car and got a stone through the radiator, and that put us out.
Then another blow in more ways than one, and this time Seaton is definitely out of the race.
This dashed all hopes of a GT victory at Bathurst.
Coming to the checkered flag, McPhee has broken the race record set last year by the Falcons. His time, 6 hours, 44 minutes, 7.9 seconds. For Bruce McPhee and co-driver Barry Mulholland, an outstanding performance in Australia's toughest car race.
The GTs might not have taken the checkered flag at Bathurst that year, but they certainly proved themselves in one of the most gruelling races ever devised. The 1968 London to Sydney Marathon.
Entrants came from all over the world. 98 cars in all, including 3 Australian Team Falcon GTs. Ahead, 10,500 grueling miles in 11 days through 11 countries. Off they go.
It really was an adventure of a lifetime. The ultimate road trip.
Here's an Australian Falcon GT arriving in Belgrade, being directed by police to the control points.
Driving a Falcon was 23-year-old Ian Vaughan, now a head honcho at Ford. But back in the 60s, he was one of the engineers.
Well, it was incredibly tough. We were going through countries like Yugoslavia, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan. The roads were really rough, and we didn't really know where we were going. These countries were pretty much uncharted in those days, and the navigation was difficult as well. Plus the problem of just millions of people on the road. When we were driving through India, for instance, the road was completely covered in people. The people would part in front of you as the car went roaring down the road.
But the cars were coming. People turned out in thousands to watch as they sped through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and down through India. Sometimes it was almost impossible. Cars had to literally push people out of the way in order to get through. And getting through was vital.
You do get some amusing events along the way, particularly when you're driving 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which we were from London to Bombay. We actually carried a toilet in the car, would you believe? We didn't actually use it. That was in case somebody got Delhi belly. So in the end, when we got to India, we handed the toilet to a guy beside the road. He didn't know what to do with it either.
The cars were shipped from Bombay to Fremantle. But it was on home turf that Ian Vaughan started making inroads on the lead.
And going through in superb mechanical condition were the 3 Australian Falcon GTs.
Coming across Australia, seeing the progress up through the field. You know, one day we would be 13th and then 12th and then 11th and then working our way up through the field day by day. It was only 3 days across Australia, but we were ripping through the field as the more fragile cars, these Escorts and Porsches and cars like that from Europe were starting to show their fragility.
By the time the rally reached the final checkpoint at Warwick Farm, the XT GT had proven its worth. A brilliant third outright.
All 3 Team Falcons home as first, second and third Australian cars, winners of the team's prize. and filling 3 out of the first 8 outright placings.
Old memories die hard. 25 years later, Ian Vaughan was determined to get the XT GT to first place. In Scrub near Canberra, the original GT was taken for a bit of a spin to blow out the cobwebs.
Well, in 1993, the organisers decided they would run a 25-year anniversary of the event, so it was 25 years after 1968. What we had then was not 25-year-old drivers, but 50-year-old drivers, but we took the same car that we'd taken in 1968. You had to take a 25-year-old car. They were the rules of the event. So we had a race across the world, really, for 25-year-old cars, which was a little different. Well, there was a big difference. For instance, in the first rally, we'd been through Yugoslavia. We couldn't go through that now. We had to come down through Eastern Europe, through Czechoslovakia and into Turkey that way. In the first event, we'd gone through Iran and Afghanistan. This time we couldn't go through that, so they put us all in an Antonov and flew us over. Flew us right over Afghanistan into India, and we continued on down through India. So I guess the political change was a little different there. The other thing that was really different about the second event was it was an out-and-out speed event. In 25 years, rallying had become a much faster sport, and we had to drive this car probably 25% faster than we'd had to drive it in the first place. So a real speed event, closed roads, or so-called closed roads in India, which is almost impossible, but time to 100th of a second and a much more competitive event. We're up against, again, the Porsches. They were 25-year-old Porsches, but pretty competitive, and there was one Porsche that pipped us at the finish. But we managed to get in second, which was a nice improvement on third 25 years ago. Well, London to Sydney's a long way. The next event that's scheduled is another 25-year anniversary in the year 2018. I think I'll be 76 then, and I may be just a little bit past it, but I'm sure the car will be ready to go again. It's certainly only just run in.
The XT GT proved itself worthy of the GT legend. To many experts, the XT was the best GT ever produced. Coming up, the master of Mount Panorama and the car that never was.
Ford, let it lead the way, come and break away.
1969 was the year of the Subaru.
New Falcon is here. The all excitement happening at your Ford dealers. Oh, new Falcon.
The new XW GT was powered by a 351 cubic inch Windsor V8, which delivered an additional 60 horsepower. But with the XW GT came something else, something that was going to change the face of motor racing forever.
Well, the HO was first of all a legend. What you have to understand, it was better than the standard XW because it was the car that they honed to go to Bathurst. And of course, it had to go around corners better than the standard GT because it was going to be driven by probably the most famous Falcon racer of all, Allan Moffat.
Canadian-born, Moffat had raced in the States in the 60s before being coaxed to join Ford Racing by its then motorsport manager, the big American Al Turner. Together, Moffat and Turner were the fathers of the GTHO.
My first involvement with the GTHO was fortunately to have been asked to drive one. But before we could drive one, we had to have one. And Al Turner, who had been brought out from America to supervise the program, asked me would I be in a position to build the prototype. And this sounds dramatic, but it wasn't all that hard for us because the shape of the car was still going to remain the same. So my two young fellows, Peter Thorne and Barry Nelson, just installed the engine, installed the gearbox, some special brakes on the back, and handmade the spoilers. So it was all quite a nice little package and looked very nifty for Al Turner to present to Ford management. He wanted a living, breathing, fire-eating machine that he could show to Bill Burke, who was the managing director at the time, into the car and give him a bit of a flamethrower ride up the Hume Highway. The program would be approved, and his rationale worked.
Moffat was soon at Bathurst, and he has vivid memories of the first time he saw the track.
We stopped on the top across Skyline, and in those days, no walls, barbed wire fences was the limit. And they said, look at the view. Isn't this fantastic? It's a fabulous sight, and it's terrific. And I've walked over to the edge of the circuit and looked out over the valley and seen Bathurst town and the ongoing hills and thought, this is really very nice. And then turned around and said to them, well, you know, aren't we a bit pressed for time? When are we going to get to the circuit? Let's get moving. And they said, you're on the circuit. I took one more glance over that valley, and that was the last time I ever looked left in my life along that shelf.
Moffat's main aim when he arrived in Australia was to conquer Mount Panorama.
My recollections of 1969 at Bathurst was, in hindsight, a pity that I didn't win it, because I felt I could have won it. I didn't actually know how to win it, and you may think that's a strange comment, but until you achieve a victory, you don't really know what you have to take out of yourself. You don't know what you have to do with the vehicle to get it to do over 160 laps at Bathurst.
By 1969, the big race on Mount Panorama had become a war, a battle between Australia's two main Australian car manufacturers, Ford and General Motors Holden.
Cars must be just as sold to the public, hence the spectator interest. Pole position on the starting grid for fastest practice times goes to 2 Falcons and a Holden.
That year I was the lead driver in the third car, so I had no illusions about my role in the team, and the Gagan brothers were quite capable of getting the victory if it was going to be achievable. But one of the things that we implemented instantly that year was a racing tire. It still had a tread pattern, and this was fine, but my teammates hadn't actually had the luxury of this type of tire on a production touring car before. And not to be unkind, but just facts are facts, they hammered the tires too hard, and both the two team cars in front of me had blowouts with rather dramatic results.
Holden tactics are to push the GTHOs, making their drivers keep foot to floor and brake as much as possible. So with every GTHO, there's a GTS close behind. Down in the pits, too, the Falcons are in trouble. A tyre blowout brings Harry Gaps in for much-needed attention. More trouble. This time it's the leader, Pete Gagan, and he's also had a blowout, but still speeding to the pits. Leo is to take over, but this unscheduled stop could cost the race. It was expected the specially imported tyres would only be changed once, but now there must be another stop. The Ford camp is obviously worried.
The checkered flag fell on Colin Bond's Monaro. Even to this day, there are many who feel that if it wasn't for the tyres, Bathurst 69 would have gone to the GTs.
And Al Turner rightly called me in thinking that I was also in danger, when in fact my tires were in good shape, and if I hadn't have had that premature pit stop, I do believe Alan Hamilton and I could have gone on to get our first victory up there, but I just had to wait a year.
Working alongside Allan Moffat on the HO program was a young engineer called Ian Stockings.
Allan Moffat was very good to work with because as a development and testing driver, he was fantastic. Allan had the ability that he could circulate at constant lap speeds, lap after lap after lap. And we then knew that any change we made to the car, that if it reflected in a lap time, it was the change to the car that actually had made the change in the lap time. There was a couple of occasions when I actually rode with him, which was quite exciting, particularly when we worked out a few problems and he'd forget that I was in the car with him, and Al Turner would be out in the track waving his arms, wanting to get his engineer out of the car.
A.M., October 4th, 1970. Pit crews make final adjustments to the mechanical thoroughbreds entrusted to their care.
In 1970, Allan Moffat raced the GT Phase 2 as a solo driver.
But Barry Seaton teams up with Fred Gibson. It's the first time competitors have the option to drive as a team or on their own. Allan Moffat decides to go it alone in the #1 Ford works entry.
There was one problem that I hadn't counted on, and this was towards, well, certainly towards about the 5-hour mark. Something started to get rather difficult to hold back, and had a pit stop, and in those days the pit stops were about 3 minutes, and I was determined that I had enough time to get my fly undone, and I didn't care where it was going to go. I just kept my feet up on the pedals so they didn't get wet, and I knew the floorboards would be hot enough to dissipate anything that was going to come out of me. And this was fine until I get a little knock on the window, and it's Adrian Ryan from Channel 7 saying, "Alan, would you have a minute?" And I would still love to see the look on my face that day, where I didn't dare stop what I was doing because that was too important, and I'm carrying on a conversation through the window at the same time. I didn't have time to get re-zipped up, and things were quite drafty on Conrod Straight for 3 or 4 laps until I could get myself back to the manner in which I started the race, shall we say.
For Allan Moffat, 1970 was the year to break the GT's drought.
Speculation about Ford's tactics is rife. There are those who feel Moffat will attempt to break up the field, especially as he's backed up by McPhee and Seaton. But the majority are convinced he'll drive only as fast as the dictates of the race demand. However, the Toranas have proved pacey in practice, so they're certain to keep the GTHOs honest. Lapping several of the smaller cars, Moffat artistically conserves the Falcon's power. Winning a Bathurst 500 ranks high among Moffat's ambitions, and he has a chance of achieving this today. But there's still a long way to go. Even at such an early stage, it seems only bad luck could rob him of victory, especially as it's now obvious McPhee is splendidly playing the role of backup driver. Blowing a tire at Forest Elbow, the Knight Ritter car is badly buckled. Moffat is right on schedule for his final pit stop, during which the crew makes their fastest turnaround. They've taken no longer than 2 minutes 45 on any stop, but this one, with fuel and 4 tires, is only 2 minutes 9 seconds. He leads McPhee and goes on to win from his teammate, with Don Holland third, a lap behind.
Revenging the humiliation of '69, the GT's blitzed Mount Panorama. Moffat took home the spoils of the Bathurst win and proved himself to be a racing champion.
Very proud.
Coming up, the GT's power on despite the odds.
Spraying cardboard carton attaches itself firmly to Moffat's radiator.
And we track down the rarest GT of them all. The next GT, the XY, sported a protruding air intake that shook with the engine. It was called, quite rightly, the Shaker.
That's how a great road car is built. New Falcon.
The XY is probably the most well-known of all the GTs, but even more famous was the Phase 3 GTHO.
The Shaker was perhaps the most potent symbol it's ever been on an Australian car. Like, it moved when the engine moved, when that fantastic 351 engine moved, and this is part of the reason why the Phase 3 GTHO is the most celebrated one of all, because that's the one that really made the name of the Falcon at Bathurst.
Unleashing its newly developed power, Moffat accelerates the GTHO to something around 140 miles per hour down Conrod.
Working on the Phase 3 was Ford Racing team manager Howard Marsden.
There were always two vehicles. People talk Falcon GT, but of course what they really remember is the Falcon GTHO. In other words, the thoroughbred product, the one with all the noise and all the performance. Well, it came into being because of competitiveness, of course, between the manufacturers, particularly between General Motors and Ford. And General Motors were running hard with the Monaro vehicle. Ford were challenging that, and General Motors decided to slip the yoke of the big V8 because they felt that nobody could sort out, again, the brakes and chassis of such a big car, and they went down to the smaller Tirana-based six-cylinder vehicle. So that left the large Falcon with supposedly an advantage, but only an advantage that could be taken out with a fair amount of work. For Phase 1, we were running around about 250 plus horsepower in those days, and it went up, and the race cars, I think, by the time we'd finished with the Phase 3s, we were somewhere above 340 horsepower out of those vehicles. Well, we were able to go well over 160 with those vehicles. Even brick-like that they were, we just had so much power. They were, at the time, rated supposedly as the fastest four-door production car in the world.
And it seemed that nothing could get in their way.
A straying cardboard carton attaches itself firmly to Moffat's radiator, which is certain to cause apprehension in the Ford pit. Marsden talks of taking immediate action.
Yes, it's surprising what can happen in motor racing. The best prepared cars can pick up a cardboard box. So we're just looking at it now. We'll possibly pull him in very quickly, pull it off and get him straight out again.
Ignoring the pit signal, Moffat stays out on the track, and Marsden approves of his action.
We offered him the opportunity to come in, but he was so happy that he almost jumped out of the car and told us that he wasn't coming in. His car is running perfectly, and he's a very happy person at this stage.
Now being lapped regularly, drivers of the slower cars are making conditions fairly comfortable for their faster counterparts.
Harry Firth, who had become Holden's team manager, was now feeling the heat from the GTs.
Harry Firth sounds philosophical.
Holden's going very well. Well, they both are, you know. They're both doing the same lap time. With this, all you do is you poke along at the best speed you can, and whatever comes out at the end, that's what you get.
The Ford team manager's obviously happy with Moffat's first pit stop.
We have a time at about 1 minute 50, and for that we have put on at least 30 gallons of fuel and done 4 complete tyres. He's a very happy man. Every time he comes by, the smile gets bigger.
On Conrod, in the last of the 130 laps, Moffat is a happy man as he approaches Murray's Corner.
After 500 miles, I can assure you this is the happiest turn a driver can make, is this left-hander onto the straight, waiting for the jubilation of his pit crew to give him the wave finishing the race.
Moffat's nearest opponent is over a lap behind.
By 1971, Moffat and the Phase 3 had earned a reputation of a winning partnership.
Everything was on the edge. The cars were actually very, very bad racing cars in that they were on the edge of being dangerous at any one time. And again, I go back to the praise for the Falcon for being so strong and also for the drivers for being so brave.
But change was in the wind. The square-bodied Falcon was about to move over for a sleeker, smoother, more streamlined car. Enter the XA and the XA GT. Meanwhile, at Ford Race headquarters in Melbourne, known as the Skunk Works, the hand-built race version of the GT, the new Phase 4, was in production.
The facilities were, I guess, what would be the word, barely adequate. I mean, we had whatever tools we needed, we got, and all of that sort of thing, but it was basically just a warehouse with some equipment in it. The Phase 4, I think, would have been marginally faster, would have handled better, I believe. And that's probably about it, I'd say.
News of the Phase 4 gave birth to reports like this, with stories of V8 monster cars turning the roads of Australia into battlefields. Hysteria was whipped up by the press, and the government soon reacted to appease a supposedly angry public.
And the government found out there was a headline, in fact, keyed by the sub-editor who was working on behalf of Mr. Green, who's no longer with us, and it said something about 160-mile-an-hour supercars on our road. Well, the government, in fact, contacted Ford, General Motors and Chrysler and put a very simple case to them. If you put these cars onto the road, you will never, ever sell another car to the government fleet. And the choice is yours. And the choice, therefore, was very easy, and it was literally a blackmail situation. Stop doing this or we won't do business with you again. And that's what stopped them, absolutely overnight.
The Phase 4 was stopped dead in its tracks. Capable of speeds over 150 miles per hour, the plug was pulled on what could have been the Aussie supercar of the 70s. But a handful of Phase 4s were made, 4 in total. One of them is lovingly cared for by Gold Coast electrician and car enthusiast Rod Mann.
This is one of 3 race cars built for Bathurst in '72, prepared by Ford Special Vehicles. They were all Brambles red, exactly the same as this. They built 3 race cars and 1 production car. And in mid-'72, with the supercar crisis, they banned the Phase 4, and these 3 cars were sold out to various people around Australia. This is now exactly as it was in '72. It's back to the ride height it was in '72 and the side exhaust systems as it was built for racing. The race car is different to the road car. The race car they ran with rev limiters off. They would run to 7,500 revs in top gear, and that's around 160 to 170 mile an hour. The whole car is fully seam welded. The roll cage is an integral part of the car. The fire extinguisher system is plumbed through the roll cage. It's a bit lumpy and bumpy, but it doesn't really like being at anything under about 2,500 to 3,000 revs. So if you can keep around the 2,500 to 3,000, it's quite pleasant. It's very, very stable. At high speed, it is a very, very stable car. And the only time you really feel ill at ease is when you have to pull up, because the brakes are a little bit ordinary.
Of the 4 Phase 4s produced, Rod has 1. Another is believed to be in country New South Wales. The only production model is owned by a Sydney dentist, so we can't show it to you on television. And the last was rallied by Bruce Hodson, but later destroyed in a car accident by a Commodore towing a caravan. Coming up, the drivers speak out about the death of the legend.
I, at the time, was quite shattered.
And GT, the next generation. The end of the Phase 4 didn't mean the end of the GT. In 1973, car parts originally destined for the Phase 4 were instead used in a vehicle called the XA GT Special, officially known as RPO 83.
When we were stopped by the government on the Phase 4 program, of course, Ford had 200 car sets of these parts that were already due for production. So they had to get rid of them. So some of the parts, some of the special locking differentials and what have you, they just sold them out to the industry. But a lot of the parts, they decided to put them onto cars. And in fact, there was a famous RPO numbering given to a range of vehicles that supposedly had a lot of the Phase 4 parts.
That same year saw the new XB GT, very similar to the XA, the most visible difference being the coloured bumpers. But new pollution laws saw the engine bridled. It looked like the Mustang-bred legend had finally been broken in. And then there was the final nail in the coffin. Ford decided to pull the pin on its motor racing program.
And the GT was a car that couldn't survive without the image of the race model. So as we lost the race model, we knew eventually that the GT, in fact, would be swallowed back into being a car that really was much too similar to the standard Falcon. And it was easy to predict the end of the GT as we lost the race program.
In June 1976 came the long-awaited call from head office. The Falcon GT was dead. The car that had pushed Australian motor racing was to be finally put out to pasture. The Australian motoring world was never to be the same again.
When the GT stopped production with the XB model, I at the time was quite shattered as a car enthusiast and I guess a self-confessed petrol head. I was disappointed that it was the end of an era, or so I thought.
But eventually, at the end of those 10 years, these supercar Falcons were deemed to be too fast for the man in the street.
I was kind of disappointed. It was the passing of an era. It certainly had served its purpose well. I don't regret it at all.
It was a sad time because, you know, in those days, I can remember the sticker that we had made, and it had, we used to put on the back of our car, it said, ban low-performance drivers, not high-performance cars, you know.
For almost a decade, the GT had ruled the road. Now they were destined to become nothing more than fondly remembered legends. The 70s and 80s passed by and the roads were dominated by small, fuel-efficient cars. But in the early 90s, the spirit of the GT began to stir. A new generation of designers and engineers reared on the GT legend were beginning to rekindle the fire.
With the product design area, which I run here, every time there is wind of any new product like that, the designers just get stuck straight into it. It's important that we show, as soon as we possibly can, the visuals or the ideas that we're trying to come up with. We're the ones that set the feel for it and start generating the real excitement, because you only need one or two images just to set the scene. And the question is, well, why not bring the GT back again? So the one thing that we can do very well is sketch, and we can come up with some really neat ideas. So without any prompt from anybody, we would go ahead and develop and sketch all of these neat ideas. And I'd say between ourselves and Tickford, we generated the want, the desire for another GT Falcon.
Steve Park is not only a top car designer, he's also recognised as an accomplished automotive artist. His works of older cars have become collector's items. But Steve doesn't always look to the past for inspiration, for he is a man with a vision of the future.
One of the first things to do when just sketching is to really capture the overall proportion. That means you put your wheels in, your silhouette from a side view perspective. You can get a little bit of detail with the wheels so you know what you're looking at. The rest of the detail comes a little bit later. So it's really from a blank sketch, it's silhouette, get the basic proportions in there and begin your detail from that point.
Although not Steve's baby, the rebirth of the GT happened by degrees. Not much has ever been said about the first of the new era GTs. The EA GT 351 was a one-off built as a feasibility study. The big 351 Windsor V8 was quite a tight fit into the EA engine bay. After a whirlwind tour of motor shows, the one and only EA GT was destroyed in a massive crusher. Next in line was the EB GT, released to celebrate the 25th birthday of the first GT in 1967. After a quarter of a century since its appearance on Australian roads, the GT was back. Coming up, the GT with the Batmobile grille. "30 years after the first GT came perhaps the most controversial Australian car of the decade. With its animalistic design and Batmobile grille, the ELGT polarised opinion. Designer of the ELGT, Steve Park.
I really do like the front end of this car. This is where we had to have a statement on the front end. This car had to be seen from down the road. It had to be seen from the 50-metre point of view. What I like most about the GT, the ELGT Falcon, is its totality and its feeling this time around of capturing all of the GT gut feeling from years ago into this one package. And I'm glad that we've actually done this quite controversial grille, if you like.
The grille's probably the most disappointing part of the car, to tell you the truth. I'm not a real fan of the grille on it.
I think it goes with the car. I think, without being rude about it, I think it looks more of a limousine GT than a GT.
Well, it's functional, but it's not conventional. If you understand what I'm talking about, it doesn't look like a GT.
I love it. I really do. As I said, you know, these are a totally different sort of a motor car. These, they're different to drive because obviously, you know, they've been refined an enormous amount in the last 15 or 20 years, but the looks of the new car, I reckon, is very stunning.
There was a good reason for the nose, because one of the things that's important with a car like a GT is respect on the road. Like it or not, it works.
For the makers of the ELGT, with so much history behind it, it was hard to come up with a car that fitted the GT image. Part of that job was the responsibility of an engineering company called Tickford Vehicle Engineering.
What we tried to do literally was imagine what the original GT owner would like today. And I think that's what we've delivered on both occasions. We've watched the original GT owner grow up. We think we know what his thoughts and aspirations are today, and we've delivered that to him.
Also involved in the production of the ELGT was Aussie racer John Bowe.
In motor racing, you're always trying to achieve impossible things like perfect balance in a car, ultimate grip, and I suppose used the knowledge that I've gained over the years with shock absorber technology and springs and anti-roll bars and bushes and all these things that go into making a car handle properly. I suppose I worked with young Steve Hoynville, who was the engineer in charge of the suspension, and to try and achieve those things that I always try and achieve with a racing car. Now, in a racing car, you very rarely get it perfect, but in terms of road cars, I think the ELGT is as perfect as you're going to get.
We think it's particularly the GT, it's a privilege to be given the custody of the name. It is the motoring icon in Australia. It is the pinnacle of everyone's idea of what a sporting Australian car should be. The buzzy cars are okay, but there's nothing like the grunt of a V8. I mean, it's just irreplaceable.
The Falcon GT has made its mark. Even today, modern cars are still compared back to the GTs of the 70s. What started as a gamble 30 years ago has become an Australian motoring legend.
The GTs was just a car to have in them days because they were, in most races, given the Holdens a bit of a butt kicking. And to see that and to see my father a part of it, I was pretty proud of that.
You know, the GT was just a leap above every other Falcon we'd ever made. You know, faster, safer, better handling.
The brakes on those cars were so bad. The boys who drove those cars were very brave, and that bravery and lack of common sense of the race driver of those days, I think, is very important.
GTHO Phase 3, fantastic car, like an absolute fantastic car, because it was a real driver's car. Down the street from a workshop, there was a stop sign and a bit of a hill up past a convent. If you dump the clutch on it from a standing start and up the hill, you could wheel spin the car with smoke billowing off the car, first and second gears, and it wouldn't stop till third gear. And at the top of the hill, you'd be doing over 100 miles an hour. You know, it's just an amazing car. And like, you know, people can't believe how those things used to go.
You'd have to say incredible, legendary, unprecedented, extraordinary, remarkable, almost a sacred object, really.
How did the GT change the automotive industry in Australia? I would say one word: exciting. It added excitement to the industry.
Mustang in the new Falcon. More excitement, more action, more thunder, more Mustang. See your Ford dealer. You won't need any spurs.
Ford, let it lead the way. Come and break our way. Ford will lead the way.
New Falcon is here. The all excitement happening at your Ford dealers. Oh, new Falcon.
Ford, it's what's happening now. The one that's fun, that's one its place in the hearts of the young.
Falcon GT, Futura, Fairmont, Falcon 500, all with exciting grand sport options and more power. Ford is now. Oh, new Falcon.
Ford, it leads the way. Ford, it leads the way. Ford, it leads the way.
The word is exhilaration. The feeling, supreme. New Falcon hardtop, a driver's car. Strong, rugged, built with unmatched performance and stamina. With low aerodynamic design, wide track, superb road holding, and the great open-air feeling of sweeping, pillarless design. Hardtop is your kind of car. Driving is believing. Falcon Hardtop, the supreme machine. Falcon 500, Fairmont, GT. Going forward is the going thing.
Joey the positive, eliminate the negative. That's on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In between. We better accent Joey the positive, eliminate all the negative. That's on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In between. With Mr. In between. Don't you mess with Mr. In between. Don't you mess with Mr.